home, Jess and Henry had a short committee meeting next morning before the others awoke. It was agreed that nobody would be allowed to stray off into the woods alone, not even with the dog. And with much mystery, Henry left some orders with all of them as to what they should build for him during the morning. "What for?" asked Benny. "Shan't tell, old fellow," teased Henry. "You just build it, and I'll see you later." So Henry walked briskly through the woods, feeling sure that the noise in the night had been made by a rabbit. Having no watch, Henry made a slight mistake by appearing at the young doctor's door before 8 o'clock. He was just in time to meet the doctor coming from a night call. If Henry had not been so eager to begin work, he would have noticed how the young man's dark eyes examined him from head to foot, even to his plastered hair, wet with brook water. It was not the doctor who directed his work, but the doctor's mother, the sweet-faced Mrs. McAllister, whose heart was centered in her son and her vegetable garden. Her heart warmed to the boy when she saw how carefully he thinned out the carrots, which had been sadly neglected. "I've been so busy," she declared, "that I have actually stayed awake nights worrying about these carrots. There, see that?" She pulled out a fairly good-sized carrot as she spoke. It had come out. It was much too near its neighbors. In fact, when Henry had thinned out half the row, he had quite a pile of edible carrots, each as large as his thumb. When Mrs. McAllister saw Henry deftly press the earth back again around the carrots, which remained standing, she left him quietly with a smile. There was a gardener whom she could trust. Henry worked steadily in the hot sun, completing row after row of carrots, parsnips, and onions. When the mill bells rang at noon, he worked on without noticing that his employer was again watching him. When he did at last notice her, he asked her, smiling, what she wanted done with the things he had pulled up. "Oh, throw them away," she said indifferently. "Toss them over into the orchard, and sometime we'll burn them when they get dry." "Do you mind if I take them myself?" asked Henry hesitantly. "Oh, no," said Mrs. McAllister cordially. "Have you chickens? That will be fine." Henry was thankful that she went right along without waiting for an answer. But in a way, he did have chickens, he thought. "You must stop working now," she said. "Any time you want to do something, there will be a place for you here." She gave him a dollar bill and left the delighted boy with piles of precious little vegetables. As long as Henry expected to return so soon, he hastily selected an orderly bunch of the largest of the carrots and the smallest of the onions, and he added a few of the miniature parsnips in for good measure. They looked like doll's vegetables. When Henry walked down the drive to with his bouquet, he would have seen a face at the window if he'd have looked up, but he did not look up. He was too anxious to get to the little old man's shop and order his meat. So it happened that Henry walked in upon his little family at about 2 o'clock with all the materials for a feast. The feast could not be made ready before night. Jess hastened to explain to Benny, who was perfectly satisfied anyway with bread and milk in his pink cup. "Your building is done," Benny informed his brother. "I builded lots of it." "He really did," agreed Violet, leading the way to the sunny, open spot, a trifle behind the house. The building was a fireplace. With an enormous amount of labor, the children had made quite a hollow at the base of the rock. This was lined completely with flat stones. More flat stones had been set on end to keep out the wind. On top of the stones lay the most wonderful collection of firewood you can imagine, all ready to light. There were chips and bits of crumpled paper, pine cones, dry twigs. Besides the big rock was a wood pile. The children had apparently been working like beavers all morning. Jess had found heavy wire in the dump and had fastened it between the two trees. On the wire, the kettle swung merrily. "Fine, fine," shouted Henry when he saw it. "I couldn't have done it so well myself." And he honestly believed it. "We will have dinner at night here," observed Jess impressively. "What did you buy?" When the girls saw the tiny vegetables, they began with cries of delight to cut them from their stalks. With Henry's knife and a broken paring knife, they scrubbed them in the washtub, filled the kettle half full with the water from the well, and proceeded in great excitement to cut the raw meat into cubes. When this had been dropped into the kettle, Henry lighted the fire. It burned frantically, as if it were trying to encourage the stew to do its best. Violet laid the tin plate over the top for a cover. They all stood by to hear the first bubble. Soon the savory stuff in the kettle began to boil in good earnest. Watch sat down gravely near it and gave an approving sniff at the intervals. "Keep it boiling," advised Henry as he departed again. "When I come home tonight, I'll bring some salt, and for mercy's sake, don't get on fire." Violet pointed silently at the big teapot. The little girl had filled it with water in case of an emergency. "That's if Benny gets on fire," she says, "or Watch." Henry laughed, and when he went on his way happily enough. He wished he might share the delightful task of keeping the fire going and sniffing the stew, but when he found out his afternoon duties, he changed his mind abruptly. "Think you can clear up this garage?" asked Dr. McAllister quizzically when he appeared. Henry flashed a look around and then around the place, and met the young man's eyes with a smile. It did indeed need cleaning rather badly. When its owner purred out in his high-powered little car, Henry drew a long breath and began in earnest. He opened all the chests of drawers to begin with. He arranged the tools in the deepest drawer, and the long-handled brush, a can of black paint that was nearly dry. He labeled the drawer "Tools" with neat lettering. Another drawer he lettered "Nails," and assorted its contents into a few of the many boxes that were lying around. He folded up the robes he found, swept off the shelves, and arranged the oil cans in orderly ranks, sorted out innumerable pairs of gloves, and then swept the floor. He washed the cement floor with a hose, and while he was waiting for it to dry, he rinsed his brushes in turpentine. To tell the truth, Henry had found a few things in the rubbish which he had stored in his own pockets. The treasure consisted in this case of a quantity of bent and rusty nails of all sizes, and a few screws and nuts. When Mr. McAllister returned at 6 o'clock, he found Henry corking up the turpentine and arranging the brushes on the shelf. "My word!" he exclaimed, staring at the garage with an open mouth. Then he drew back his head and laughed till his mother came down to see what the matter was. "Look at my gloves, Mother," he said, wiping his eyes. "All mated up. They never met each other before. I remember. Mrs. McAllister looked the garage over and observed the newly labeled drawers. Her son opened one of them and looked at his 4 hammers. "My tack hammer, Mother," he said. "Your tack hammer and 2 other hammers. That last one I never expected to see again. If you can use it, you may have it, my boy." Now it is no exaggeration to say that at that moment Henry had been asked if he wanted what he wanted most of anything in the world, he would have answered without any hesitation whatever, a hammer. He accepted it gratefully, hardly able to stand still, So anxious he was to put it into use in the hill he called home. "Tomorrow's Sunday," said the doctor. "I shall see you Monday." "Oh, yes," said Henry, who had lost track of the days. "The cherries need picking," he said to his new friend. "We could use a number of cherry pickers if they were as careful as you." He gave him an odd look. "Could you?" asked Henry eagerly. I'll surely come down." With that he bade his friends good-bye and started for home, richer by another $1, 2 doughnuts and that the cook had given him, and a pocketful of crooked nails and the rest of the vegetables. When he reached his freight car home, a delicious savor greeted him. "Onions!" he shouted, running to the kettle. The cook stood by, took the top off the cover, and put in the salt. It was absolutely the most tantalizing odor that Henry had ever smelled. Years afterward, Jess tried to duplicate it with the same kettle, vegetables, and the same garden, and all stirred with the same spoon, but it didn't equal this stew in flavor. "A ladle, sure as I live," gasped Henry. Jess had found a tin cup in the dump and had fastened on a wooden handle with a bit of wire. And when she ladled out 4 portions on 4 plates of all sizes, some of them tin, and laid a spoon in each, the children felt the world held no greater riches. The tiny onions floated around like pearls. The carrots melted in your mouth, and the shreds of meat were tender as possible from long boiling. A bit of bread in one hand helped the feast along wonderfully. The little wanderers ate until they could eat no more. "I have time before dark to make Benny's cart," observed Henry, biting a crisp sweet carrot. "With my wheels?" asked Benny. "Yes, sir, with your wheels," agreed Henry. "Only when it's done, you'll have to cart stones in it." "Sure," said Benny with satisfaction. "Cart stones or anything." "We'll need it in making the dam," explained Henry for the benefit of his sisters. "Tomorrow's Sunday, so I shan't work in the town." "You think it's all right to build the pool on Sunday, Jess?" "I certainly do," said Jess with emphasis. "We're building a dam just so we can keep clean. I guess if Sunday is your only day off, it'll be all right." Henry's conscience was set at rest as he began with a great delight to hammer out his bent nails. He and Benny ran about finding pieces of wood to fasten the wheels on. A visit to the dump was necessary at last, in order to find just the right piece of timber for a tongue. But before it was too dark to see, Henry had pounded out the last nail in place and trundled the flat cart back and forth just to see it go. The cart seemed valuable enough to all of them to take into the house for the night, and Henry could not afford to laugh at Benny for going to sleep with his hand upon one of the precious wheels, for he himself had tucked his new hammer under his pillow. Building the dam. Even a hammer makes a good pillow if one is tired enough. And the freight car family slept until 9 o'clock church bells began to ring faintly in the valley. There were at least a dozen churches, and their faraway bells sounded sweet, harmonious, in so many different keys. "They almost play a tune," said Violet as she listened. "I like the music all right," said Henry in a businesslike way, "but I, for one, shall have to get to work." "This will be a good day to wash all the stockings," said Jess. "We'll all be wading so much in the brook anyway." After the breakfast, the first thing Henry did was survey with critical eyes the spot that they had chosen for the pool. It was a hollow about 3 yards across. There were no stones in it at all. "It's big enough already," remarked Henry at last, but it hasn't enough water in it. He measured its depth with a stick. We'll have to guess at inches, he said. I have a little tape measure in my work bag, ventured his sister Violet. Henry flashed a smile at her. Is there anything you haven't got in your work bag? He asked. The children measured the wet stick carefully. The water was just 10 inches deep in the deepest part. Henry explained his plan of engineering to his sister. We'll have to haul some big logs across this narrow part and stuff them from this end with stones and underbrush. I thought it ought to be 3 feet deep before we get through. Oh, Henry, protested Jess. Benny could get drowned. Drowned? Echoed Henry. How tall do you think he is, anyhow? They measured the little boy and found him to be 42 inches tall. That settled it. The pool was designed to be 3 feet in depth. Luckily, the largest logs were not far away, but as it was a matter of great labor for the builders to drag them to the scene of the operations. Let's all get the logs up here first, suggested Jess. Then we can have fun of laying them across. The 2 older children dragged all the logs, while Violet and Benny attended to the stones. With the help of the cart, occasionally Henry was called upon to assist with heavy stone, but for the most part, Benny puffed out his cheeks and heaved the stones himself. In fact, Henry decided at this point to let Benny drop them into the water as he gathered them. Splash 'em right in, old fella, he said. Only keep them in a nice straight line across this place between these 2 trees. It won't make any difference how wet he gets, he added as an aside to Jess. We can dry him in the sun. Jess thought a little differently, although she said nothing. She took off Benny's little crinkled blouse and 1 pair of bloomers and started to hang them on the line. Good time to wash them, she exclaimed. Let me wash them, begged Violet. You're more useful building the dam. There was wisdom in this suggestion, so Jess accepted it gratefully, and even added Henry's blouse to the laundry. When we finish the dam, they will surely be dry, she said. As for Henry, he was only too glad to work without it. Makes me feel lighter, he declared. Rare and beautiful birds came and watched the barefoot children as they scurried around, building their wall of masonry, but the children did not have any eyes for the birds then. They watched with delighted eyes as each stone was added to the wall under the clear water, and it began to rise almost to the surface. That makes a solid foundation for the logs, you see, explained Henry with pride. They won't be floating off downstream the minute we lay them on. Then at last the time came when they were to lay the logs. Let's wedge the first one between these 2 trees, said Jess with a happy thought. Then, if each end of the log is on the upper side of the trees, the harder the water pounds, the tighter the dam gets. Good work, exclaimed Henry admiringly. That's just what we'll do. But the children were not at all prepared for what happened in the moment the first log was splashed into its place on top of the stone wall. The water, defeated in its course down the rocky bed, gurgled and chased about as it met the opposing log, and found every possible hole to escape. Leaks, said Henry briefly, as the water began to rush around both ends and pour over the top of the log. We'll make the log so thick it can't get through. We'll lay 3 logs across, with 3 logs on top of them, and 3 more on top of that. The children set about stubbornly to accomplish this. Violet held great sprays of fine underbrush in place until each log was laid. Wetter children never were seen, but even Benny caught the fever of conquering this mischievous water, which slipped from their grasp like quicksilver. When the 3 top logs were at last dropped into place, the excited children sat down to watch the pool fill. fill. This it did slowly. Finding now no means of exit, the water was quieter. It rose steadily up the barricade of logs. It widened beautifully. Henry could not sit still. "It slopes," he cried. "See how clear it is, and still. See how still it is." And then the water began to overflow the logs. It spilled over the top with a delightful curve, and on the other side formed a second waterfall, not high and narrow and graceful like natural waterfalls above, but very low and wide, just like a regular mill dam, said Henry. He held the measuring stick out as far as he could plunge it into the water. It lacked an inch of being 3 feet deep. "Deep enough," he declared. In fact, it looked so deep that Benny could not conceal a slight fear. "That's the beauty of the slope," observed Jess. "Benny can wade just as far as he wants to, and no further. We all know what the bed of the pool is like. No holes or stones." The girls had to leave to prepare dinner, but Henry could not be persuaded to leave the wonderful swimming pool. "I'd rather swim than eat," he said. Luckily for the children, their supply of provisions was the largest of any day since their flight. The girls lit the fire and heated up the remainder of the stew, cut the bread, the butter, hard and cold in the refrigerator, was taken out, and 4 portions cut from it. The 2 doughnuts made 4 half rings for dessert. The cooks rang the dinner bell. This was an ingenious arrangement hung on a low branch. It consisted of a piece of bent steel that swung on a string. Violet hit it sharply with another piece of steel. It sounded deeply and musically through the woods, and the boys understood it and obeyed at once. It was evident from the moment they appeared that at least 3 of them had been swimming. Watch shook himself violently at intervals, spattering the water droplets in every direction. Henry and Benny, fresh and radiant, with plastered hair and clean dry stockings and blouses, apparently liked to swim and eat too. "You can actually swim a few strokes in it, Jess, if you're careful," Henry said with excusable pride, and he sat down to dinner. "Building a dam is wonderful sauce for a dinner." "I think stew is much better the second day," observed Benny, eating hungrily. There remained 2 more adventures for the eventful day. The girls cut their hair. Violet's dark curls came off first. "They're awfully in the way," explained Violet, "and as much trouble when you're working." They were tangled too, and Jess cut them evenly by a string with Violet's little scissors. Jess's chestnut hair was long and silky and nicely braided, but she never murmured as it came off too. The girls ran to the brook mirror to see how they looked. The new haircut was very becoming to both. "I like you better that way," said Henry approvingly. "Lots more sensible when you're living in the woods." Around 4 o'clock, the children took a long walk in the opposite direction from their other explorations. They were rewarded by 2 discoveries. One was a hollow tree, literally filled with walnuts, gathered presumably by a thrifty squirrel the previous fall. The other discovery frightened them a little at first, for with bristling back and a large bark, Watch suddenly began to rout out something in the leaves, and that something began to cackle and half run and half fly away from the intruders. It was a runaway hen. The children succeeded in catching the dog and reducing him to order, although it was clear he liked very much to chase hens. "She had some eggs, too," remarked Benny, as if trying to make pleasant conversation. Jess bent over incredulously and saw a rude nest in the moss in which there were 5 eggs. "A runaway hen," said Harry, hardly believing his eyes. "She wants to hide her nest and raise chickens." The children had no scruples at all taking the eggs. Almost a gift from heaven, said Violet, stroking one of the eggs with a delicate finger. It wouldn't be polite to refuse them. Scrambled eggs made a delicious supper for the children. Jess broke all the eggs into the biggest bowl and beat them vigorously with a spoon until they were light and foamy. Then she added milk, salt, and delegated Violet to beat them some more while she prepared the fire. The big kettle, empty and clean, was hung over the low fire, and butter was dropped in. Jess watched it anxiously, tipping the kettle slightly in all directions. When the butter had reached the exact shade of brown, Jess poured the eggs and stirred them carefully, holding her skirts away from the fire. She was amply repaid for her care when she saw her family attack the meal. Clearly, this was a feast day. We shall have to be satisfied tomorrow to live on bread and milk, she observed, scraping up the last morsel. But when tomorrow came, they had more than bread and milk, as you will soon see. That's it for today. Hope you guys are enjoying the story. I love listening to it again. It's still one of my favorites. If you guys are enjoying it and you want me to keep reading, send me a message on Dojo telling me that you like it and that you are still listening, okay? Love you guys. See you later.